Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed and on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no. 15
Amateur Traveler, episode 814. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about castles, abbeys, and palaces, a princess, a love story, and a tragedy as we do a road trip in Austria on the Princess Sisi Road.
I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Austria. I'd like to welcome to the show Michael January, screenwriter, author, and travel writer. You can find Michael's work at bargaintraveleurope.com, among other places. And Michael, you have come to talk to us about Vienna and then a road trip from Vienna. Welcome to the show first.
Thank you.
You pitched me the Empress Sisi Road.
We met unlikely on a jet boat in Idaho,
That is true.
which was fun, but following the Empress Sisi Road is quite different from that.
Where are we here? Let's put it on a map first before we get started talking about it.
Okay, Vienna, or Austria, is south of Germany, north of Italy, and then stuck between Hungary and Switzerland. Parts of the Alps are in Austria. Part of the country is flat and rolling, and the other part is very mountainous. A lot of people know Austria from the Sound of Music, singing from the mountaintops and all of that. That's from Tyrol, from around Salzburg to the west. Austria is rather wide east to west, but rather narrow north to south. This is a road trip, so that the east to west distance can be surprising.
And then the Empress Sisi Road goes from where to where?
The Empress Sisi Road, actually there are multiple Empress Sisi Roads. Elizabeth, the Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, is the Princess Diana of the German-speaking world. She was a girl that loved the country, and at 16, I believe it was 16, she was introduced to the Emperor of Austria, and they married, and it was a storybook love story, and she became the fashion idol because she was beautiful. Halfway through her life, she got older, then tragedy struck, and she was ultimately assassinated. But there have been movies told about the romantic story of the emperor and the young empress. There's a new series coming out on Netflix in September or October, shot in Germany, about the romantic love story. There was a movie in the 50s with Romy Schneider as the Empress Sisi. And somebody just reminded me that there was a movie in 1968 with Ava Gardner playing the Empress Elizabeth, and Omar Sharif playing her son. We'll get to that a little bit.
I will trust the screenwriter when you tell me that it was not something that I knew. And then why should someone drive the Empress Sisi Road?
Well, things get called that because there are interesting places along some kind of route, and people put them together and call them the something or other road. There are sites in Germany, Empress Sisi sites in Germany, there are some in Hungary, and there are some in Austria. And each one is called the Empress Sisi Road. It's basically sites that are part of the story of interesting places to visit, and you have to travel along a road to get there. So it's not a street, it's a collection of destinations.
What kind of itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
Let's start out in Vienna. Vienna is an incredible city. It's very walkable. The feature of Vienna is it has a Ringstrasse, a road that kind of goes around the old town. And everything within that ring is very walkable. So if you stay somewhere, you stay somewhere on the spoke of the wheel, and you spend your time going into the center of the city. It was the capital of the Austrian-Hungary Empire, which reached its height. Emperor Franz Joseph was Sisi's husband, and it reached that height in the mid-1800s. It ended with World War I. The empire ended with World War I. So there's a time frame where a lot of things fit, and the buildings are beautiful, and there's something in Vienna called the cafe culture. It was invented in Austria, basically because people were waiting for their audiences with the emperor or the government officials, and they would sit in the coffee shops and look at all the other people that were waiting for their appointments. So it became a common thing in Vienna. And a lot of those cafes still exist. One of them, the Mozart Cafe, was made famous from the movie The Third Man because it was right across the street from the Sacher Hotel. And the Sacher Hotel is famous for being a hotel, but also the Sacher Torte, a delicious cake.
Right.
But very near there, there's a confectioner called Dremel, and they were the confectioner to the emperor. And you can go there and watch them make candies now. And you can sit outside in a cafe and you can do things that you do at a cafe, but you can watch them make candy. There are a number of fascinating sort of stylish restaurants. Schwarz and Camille, the Black Camel, is quite an extraordinary place to go and enjoy your coffee, a meal. The Café Diglas is a great place to have breakfast. They've been having breakfast there for 100 years.
While you're paused, I wanted to mention something about The Third Man. You mentioned the famous movie Third Man. Some people who are younger than me don't remember that. I don't remember when it came out because it came out before I was born, but it was a spy movie set in Vienna shortly after World War II. And it's interesting from an amateur traveler point of view because the last time we talked about Vienna in a in-depth way was a little over, I think, 9 years ago, but it was with the museum curator for the Third Man Museum in Vienna. So you can go back and listen to that episode if you want more of that information about spies in Vienna.
Yeah, it's what a lot of people, if they're familiar with Vienna from movies, that's probably the movie they're familiar with it from. And yes, that was the post-war. And the Ferris wheel that was in that movie with Orson Welles talking about dots moving, and if one would stop moving, would you care? That still exists. It just celebrated its 125th, I think, anniversary. And you can even have a dinner party on it, but it still exists. But Sisi, the Empress, Vienna is the imperial city. So a lot of the sites are related to the empire and the emperor and the empress. On this particular trip, this was my third trip to Vienna. I got interested in the Empress Sisi because of Mark Twain. I like to say in Europe, the best travel guides are Napoleon and Mark Twain because they went to all the best places, and they're the best places because they went there.
Mark Twain had a little less impact on the places than Napoleon did,
but you can follow him, and he usually left his mark.
He did indeed leave his mark.
He left his mark like a dog marking territory, and the same is true for Vienna. There's a cafe called the Greichenbasel, which on near Greichen Street, and it was a very famous place in its time, and it has a room that is filled with signatures. Mozart, Beethoven, a bunch of other famous people, and Mark Twain all wrote their signature on the wall in this room in the Greichenbasel. If you want to eat in that room, I think you probably have to arrange it as a group. But they'll let you go and visit. They'll let you go and if there's nobody in there, you can go in and look. And they'll show it. They kind of point with a stick, the different signatures all around the room.
And you say Mark Twain, and I think of him and Europe being Innocents Abroad. I don't know if he had other books that were covering that trip.
He went around the world a couple of times, but he had 3 major trips to Europe. 2 he wrote books about, and the third, and which is why I got interested in the Empress Sisi, is late in Mark Twain's life, he went through a very tragic period. He spent a lot of money on a printing press and nearly went broke. So he had to go out on speaking engagements again to raise money. So he was going to go to Europe to talk to the crown heads of Europe and tell his stories. And right after the ship left to go on this trip, his youngest daughter died. But he had to go. He couldn't go back. His wife went back. He couldn't go back. So he was in Vienna on his speaking tour, grieving over the death of his daughter. and he was feeling his mortality. And this is when the famous quote about stories of my death are greatly exaggerated, that happened in Vienna. And it happened at a time that Mark Twain got introduced to several people in the Imperial Society and friends of the Empress. And this was where it turns a little bit morbid, was the Empress Sisi was assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist in 1898. And Mark Twain got fascinated because it was the murder of a celebrity. Like Princess Diana, who died tragically because she was a celebrity. Same thing happened to Sisi. And Mark Twain was fascinated because the transatlantic cable had just been laid. So they knew of the death in San Francisco before they could get a letter to the emperor in Vienna. And Mark Twain was fascinated. It was the first worldwide murder of a celebrity. But Mark Twain was living in Vienna, and he wrote about this. He didn't publish it in a book, but he witnessed the funeral of the Empress, her body was brought back to Vienna, and she was buried in the Kaisergruft, the imperial burial chamber, which was right across from the hotel where he was staying, which was then called the Krantz Ambassador. Now it's the Ambassador Hotel. And it still exists, and the balcony where he watched the arrival of her Black Maria hearse, he could watch it. And today you can go and you can stand on that balcony. It's where the restaurant is in the hotel, but there's a beautiful bar on the upper floor. They used to hold concerts back in the 1800s. But it's a great place to sit and have a drink. And this beautiful bar in the Hotel Ambassador, and then where Mark Twain probably sat and had a drink. And look out the window across the Neuermarkt to where the Kaisergruft. So anyway, I don't mean to get morbid here, but it's one of the reasons why I personally got into following Sisi and tied into Mark Twain. But anyway, the Sisi sites in Vienna, they're in the Hofburg, which is the palace. And the reason the cafe culture happened was because the palace is right in the middle of town. In other places, it was other royal places. It was hard to get to where the palace was. But in Vienna, it was like right in the middle of town. So the Hofburg is in the middle of town. And now there is a Sisi museum, takes up part of the palace and what they call the imperial apartments. So you can go in what's called the Silber Museum. The Silberkammer is basically all the imperial dishes and table placements and all of that. And then there are the imperial apartments, which is the actual palace, so you can see what the rooms were like. And the Sisi Museum is part of that, and it has her dresses. She was famous for fashion until tragedy struck. In the last part of her life, she always wore black. But in her younger life, she wore beautiful dresses, and you can see some of them there in the Sisi Museum. Okay. And right across the way from the Sisi Museum is the Lipizzaner Stallions, the Spanish riding school, which people heard a lot about. And Sisi was very much into horses. So if you're in Vienna and you get a chance, the Spanish riding school is one of the things to do. They have a kind of a mixed schedule. Sometimes are practices and sometimes are performances. And when you're there, you have to figure out if you have a schedule, if you can fit it into your day. But it's certainly worth doing. On this occasion, I was sitting in a ground floor box seat, the upper level seats, the high. Cheaper prices, you sit higher and lower price. It's like the orchestra and seats in a theater. So we were sitting there, and one of the horses took a lovely dump right in front of our box seat. So it was very authentically aromatic until the guy comes out with his bucket and cleans it up and takes it away. But it's a lovely experience and very sort of traditional thing to do in Vienna. Other site within Vienna is the Schönbrunn Palace, which is one of the great imperial palaces. If you're going to visit a palace in the world, if you want to see a palace, Schönbrunn is one of the ones to see. It's quite glorious. It's very large. You can spend a lot of time there. And Sisi spent time there. She's not as much associated with that palace as Sophia was, and Sophia Therese. But on the grounds is what is called the Imperial Coach. And it has all the royal coaches there, all the great golden pumpkins. If you think about Cinderella golden carriages and wedding carriages, and it's full of all those very extraordinary kind of things. Also, it has uniforms and clothing, but For Sisi, there is a section there that represents her interest in horses. So it has saddles and clothing and pictures and a whole bunch of things about her interest in horses. And also in there is the actual Black Maria that carried her that Mark Twain watched. So it is still existent and it's sitting there. They don't promote it very much because that's not the brightest thing about the Sisi story. But it is there and it's quite extraordinary. If you don't know what a Black Maria is, that's what you find out what it is. Then on this trip, I wanted to travel outside of the city to some other site. So that's why I followed the Empress Sisi Road. The nearest spot outside, and it's quite remarkable, is called the Hermes Villa. It's called the Hermes Villa because there's a statue of the Greek god Hermes that's out in the garden. It was called something else, and they decided to call it after the statue. The story of Sisi was she was a young 16-year-old girl who marries the handsome emperor, but she was from the country, and she got very tired of Vienna city life. Because the court's in the middle of the city, so everything was like in the city, and she liked the country. And so she started to travel. And the emperor said, well, don't travel so much. I'll build you someplace out in the country you can go to. So he built her this Hermes Villa, which is out in a former hunting park, but it is still a park. Most palaces are filled with tourists, and you go in the line and stuff, and there are people, all sorts of people wandering around, and they're easy to get to. You take a taxi or you get off a tram or something. The Hermes Villa is only like 5 minutes, 5, 10, 15 minutes outside of the city, but it's still in the middle of the hunting park. So it's a 15-minute walk from the parking lot to actually get to this country palace. And it's very intimate, and there's a restaurant there, so if you get tired from walking to 15 minutes, you can stop and refresh yourself at the restaurant. But as a palace, it's very intimate. Some palaces you go through and you go, how could someone live here?
Yes.
But this one feels very livable, and her bedroom is there as it was, and it's unchanged. They managed to recover it, and it missed some of the problems of other places. History did not treat some other palaces very well.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers was a peaceful tea house surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds? Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. Arigatou gozaimasu. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel, explore.
This one it did, and it's a lovely place. You can get there by public transportation, but I rented a car because I was going to go out of the city.
Okay. You're starting this trip, yeah.
So we can talk a little bit about car rental in Europe. I rented from Sixt, which is a UK company operating in Europe. I've also liked to rent from Europcar. And I've done both in Austria. You can rent from airports, but you pay a premium, a higher price renting from an airport. So I like to rent from railway stations because I often combine car and rail travel in Europe. Because if you get a rail pass or something else, you're traveling around mostly by rail. But if you want to get off the train for a while, you rent a car and drive. So there are lots of car rental places around rail stations.
Time I found that a disadvantage is when I rented a car in Rome. If you rent out of the airport, you're out of the city and it's easy to drive. If you rent in town, you're in Rome, which is a pretty chaotic place to rent. But Vienna would not be as intimidating a place to drive as Rome.
Yeah, fortunately with Vienna, you can drive around it.
Right.
I rented a car in Paris once and had to get out. And actually,
that can also be
intimidating.
We were nearly in an auto accident in the tunnel where Princess Diana died a few years before she did. And so it wasn't all that surprising for me that happened.
I might have been in that tunnel. Not totally certain. But yeah. And Vienna is a walkable town, so I didn't want to have a car for days in the town and try to figure out where to park it. So I wanted to rent after I had done a few days and then was ready to go on the road trip. So that's why West Bahnhof, the West Rail Station. There is where the car rental places are in Vienna. And you definitely want to get something with GPS, especially you don't want to be wandering, trying to drive around looking at maps and stuff like that. I got a lovely picture of myself in the mail from some town in Germany. Because they have these speed cameras, and if you drive too fast into town, and there's a lovely picture of me looking at a map as I'm driving into town. You can see my eyes just over the top of the map as I'm driving into town. Fortunately, you don't have to do maps anymore. But also the problem with GPS is you have to have an address. Because I've also found, because I've written 5 books on castles, so I'm always looking for castles and churches and stuff. And you tell a map that you're looking for a castle, and the GPS has no idea. It wants an address. So you have to figure out what an address is to get to where you want to go. So you have to be careful about that. The Hermes Villa is on the way out of town. The next nearest place, these few places are not that far from Vienna. So if you just wanted to do a day trip and go out 30 minutes, an hour, get somewhere, and then come back to the city, you can do that. The next nearest place is called Mayerling, which is associated with city because of her son, the Archduke and Crown Prince Rudolph, which is part of her tragic story, is that Rudolph was found dead with his 17-year-old mistress in what is still a mystery, whether it was a murder-suicide, a double murder, or who killed who first, is still an unsettled mystery, and they've been debating that ever since. Still debating it. But Mayerling was the country hunting lodge of the Crown Prince Rudolph. And after the murder-suicide, the emperor said, we're not going to destroy it, but we're going to turn it into a memorial chapel. So now it is like a half church, half manor house. So you walk inside and you walk in the door and it has an altar just like a church, but then there's the back rooms are like a palace, which now include an exhibit about the story. And fortunately it's in English, unlike a lot of other things where all the stuff is in German, but this one's in English. And it's quite fascinating. And there's even a coffin. Apparently, the mistress was buried 4 times, which is a story in itself. The crown prince is buried in the Kaisergruft, the crypt back in Vienna, where both the emperor, Sisi, and the son are all side by side in a room in the Kaisergruft. But Mayerling is an active Carmelite, not monastery, but a nunnery.
I got it.
But it's out in the middle of the Vienna woods, which is the area that's to the immediate west of Vienna. Beautiful woodland country, and I was following Mark Twain out there because he lived out there, and there's a little town called Kaltenleutgeb. And Mark Twain stayed in a little villa out there, and it's a tiny little town. There is nothing else there other than a church and this little thing where he stayed. You can't visit it. It's a private residence, but there is a plaque on the outside that oddly has a Mississippi steamboat plaque outside saying that Mark Twain stayed there. But it's on Karlstrasse, on Karl Street in the middle of this town. But it's like an Easter egg hunt to try to go find this place with your GPS. But it's very near Mayerling. Also very near Mayerling is the Heiligenkreuz Abbey, which is a fascinating place. It is the second oldest Cistercian abbey. The Cistercians were the order that supported the Templars.
I didn't realize they were associated. Okay.
Yes. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was a French monk who supported the original Templars in their efforts. And the money of the Templars would pass through the network of Cistercian abbeys.
So when you say the money, you're talking about where they did almost a Western Union of their day, where you could leave your money with the Templars and pick it up someplace else.
They invented banking.
Which is why they became unpopular.
You deposit your money in one abbey, and they send a record that you have deposited that to another abbey. So that's how they got rich and how the Templars got rich. But the Cistercians are still very active. And you recognize the Cistercian because they're in black and white robes. But you can tour this abbey. It's still active. Unlike some other abbeys that I was visiting in Austria, it is not Baroque. It is Gothic, so it's an earlier one. And On the weekends, you only can visit in the if you want to take a tour, you have to go in the afternoon. During the week, they'll have morning visits, but on the weekends, they're only in the afternoon. What they're doing in the morning on the weekend, I don't quite know. But you can listen to Gregorian chants. They basically chant all day long. So if you want to hear Gregorian chants in a Gothic church, that is one of the places to go to do that. I was going to mention, right next to Meierling is a lovely little outdoor cafe called the Alte Jagdschloss. I'm sure the tour buses stop there a lot. Actually, Meierling is one of the lesser visited places. I know the tour buses go there, but it's a little off the beaten track. It's a little hard to find the signs. I was going to mention the Meierling movie, the 1968, which was about the murder-suicide of the Crown Prince Rudolph and his mistress, Mary Vitsera, with Omar Sharif.
And what was the movie?
It was
Omar
called
Sharif, okay.
It was called Meierling. Omar Sharif played the Crown Prince Rudolph. Catherine Deneuve played the young mistress. James Mason was the emperor, and Ava Gardner was Empress Elizabeth. I've never seen it, but someone reminded me of it.
Got it.
So then from there, the other near place that you can either go on your way or go back to Vienna is the Laxenburg Park. The Laxenburg Castle Park is another large hunting ground. And Franz Joseph's, the emperor's favorite castle there, is called Franzenburg Castle. It's an entirely recreated medieval castle. It was built in the 1800s, just like a lot of the castles on the Rhine that are all reimagined medieval castles. It has a tower, but its unique feature, it's still surrounded by a moat. And to get there, you have to take a ferry across the moat to get to the island where the castle is. And you have to take a guided tour. It's not a self-guided tour. You have to arrange for a guided tour of the castle. Or you can go climb the tower separately on a separate tour of the tower if you don't have time for the castle. But it's surrounded by I guess you would call it a tourist town. It's been a popular place for a long time in Austria. But there's a medievalish town surrounding it outside of the park gate, and lovely place to stop and eat and stuff, but it's quite popular, so it can have a lot of people there. But it's about 20-30 minutes from downtown Vienna. So if you just wanted to take a side trip, you could do Meierling and you could do Laxenburg, just go out and go back to the city. My trip was a much longer version. I actually went all the way to Switzerland on this trip it was about a 15-day trip. Went down to Italy. You just had an episode on hiking near Cortina d'Ampezzo. On this trip, I went from Vienna to Cortina, which is just south of the Austrian border. And then I ended up spending some time there. I did some paragliding in Cortina and drove an Audi on the windy roads with the Audi driving experience. And I knew Cortina from the original Pink Panther movie with...
I did associate the two. Okay.
Yeah, the Pink Panther was set in Cortina d'Ampezzo, so that's where I knew it from, with the Princess Dalla on the tiger rug. That all took place in Cortina with the stealing of the dog and on the slopes. And so it still has that sort of European Hollywood history. Shot movies there and things. Anyway, so that was a point on this trip. And then I ended up going all the way out to Geneva on this trip, but I'm not suggesting for an itinerary for someone to plan to do that. Let's stick with the Sisi Road.
Okay.
So from Meierling or Laxenburg, you can head down to a palace called the Esterhazy Palace, which is about a little over an hour from Vienna to the south, and take the A2, and then from there you can take the S6, which goes past Graz. I wouldn't suggest Graz on this trip, but you can go down to a town called Spielberg, like the film director. I don't know if he's associated with Spielberg. I wouldn't be surprised. Spielberg is where the Red Bull Ring racetrack is. If anybody has an interest in autos or anything like that, you can stop at the Red Bull Ring and you can take a tour of the track. Or you can drive a car. They have a program where you can just rent a car. You can drive on the track. You don't have to take a class. You follow an instructor around until you get it down and say, okay, I got this, I know how this works, and then they'll let you go out on your own. So that can be an interesting experience. But there's a lovely hotel, which actually is owned by the Red Bull people, or the same country, called the Schloss Gabelhofen, which is a lovely hotel. It's a little upscale, but the reason it's a good stop is it's on the way. You don't want to spend hours and hours driving, so it's a good distance to stop. And then from there, you take a windy country road.
And it looks like that is a stay in a older castle.
It is a castle hotel. There's not much of the castle actually left, but it was quite lovely.
The outside looks like one, the inside, not so much. Yeah.
Yeah, part of the outside looks like a castle, but it's been entirely reconstructed and recovered into a hotel. I had a lovely experience getting up before I had the windows open. So, because I don't like a lot of heat, so to have some breeze come in, so the windows were open. Just before the sun came up, the birds were singing like a chorus. They weren't chirping, they were like singing. It was like an orchestrated chorus of all these different bird sounds outside my window. When the sun came up, they calmed down. The birds like the pre-sun. But it was quite lovely. And fortunately, I had very good weather. They have a lovely restaurant there as well. That's called the Murtal Valley. And there are a couple of sites I was interested in. But I came that way because I wanted to go to the Admont Abbey, which features a Baroque library. If you have not seen a Baroque library, one should go out of one's way to find one.
I have, and I know wherever you speak. Yes, they're amazing.
There are a couple of them in Austria. There's one in Switzerland. But this one is Admont, which is, from Spielberg and Gabelhofen, you would head north. I'm heading north on the direction of the next site on the Sisi Road. But from the Admont, it's a beautiful, lovely, winding country roads. And certainly this was in summertime, and I was competing on these lovely winding roads with a lot of motorcycles, because the motorcycles like the windy roads. But the countryside is beautiful. And then from Admont, you head up to Bad Ischl, which is another Sisi site, which is where the 23-year-old emperor and 15-year-old Elizabeth first met. She was from the House of Wittelsbach. Her uncle was Mad King Ludwig. And actually at the Hermes Villa, there is a photograph of the dead Mad King Ludwig. His actual coffin death photo is back at the Hermes Villa. But so she was from that family. But Bad Ischl is a town very near. It's in the Salzkammergut region of Austria, near the lake where the city of Hallstatt is. That is a sort of a famous city to visit. It is such a iconic Tyrolean or Austrian city on a lake that a real estate developer in China created one.
I knew that they had recreated one. I didn't know that was what it was from. Okay.
Yeah, they built Hallstatt in China, but you can go to the real one from Bad Ischl. They got engaged at a former salt trader's house, which is now the city museum in Bad Ischl. There's the Kaiser Villa and what's called Sisi's Cottage, or the Marmerschlossel, which was a tea house where Sisi stayed. But it's a lovely area. You can spend some time around there, go to the lake, do the salt tours.
When you say the salt tours, these are the salt mines.
The salt mines, where the wealth came from. The salt was white gold this era, and there were underground caves of salt, and they mined the salt, and that's where a lot of the wealth came from, and that's the area where it was, which it's near Salzburg. It's a little south of Salzburg. Salzburg is a city of salt. Berg is an old town, and Salz is salt, so Salzburg is the city of salt.
And the one picture in my mind of the salt mine tours is the one of people sliding down something near the end of it, which apparently is the way you get out of the salt mine, I think, or into it. I'm not sure which. I have not done this tour.
I have not done a salt mine tour either, so that's on my list to do. But yes, I recognize that is some kind of salt slide that they used to slide the chunks down. You cut out a chunk of salt, and I think you had to slide it down a chute. And so I think you can slide down those chutes now. From Bad Ischl, maybe a little off the trail, there is a Disneyland of hotels, especially for families, in this area of the Tyrol, a place called the Stangelwirt, Stanglwirt, which is now a 5-star hotel. It's not cheap, but it is extraordinary. It's right below a mountain called the Wilderkaiser.
Okay.
And part of that is called the Kaiser Krone, because it's a series of mountain peaks in a semicircle. So they call it the Emperor's Crown, which is a great spot for hiking, and this place is right below it. But the Stangelwirt started as a coaching inn, basically, for mule teams carrying stuff over the mountain passes, and they stopped at this place. And it was a farm and a coaching inn. And then, I think it was back in the 50s, a fellow started to grow it. And it is now a very large bio-resort. And the reason I mention it as part of the Sisi Road is if you saw the Lipizzaner stallions at the Spanish riding school in Vienna,
Right.
and especially if you have kids, Stangelwirt has an agreement with the Spanish riding school to stud horses. So they stud the Lipizzaner horses. If you want to ride a baby Lipizzaner stallion, you can do that out at Stangelwirt. And they let kids do that. You go there, and there are all these kids being walked around on these Lipizzaner stallions. But they have a lot of equestrian activities. But it is a 5-star resort with spas. There's this room where you relax from the spas with a Marineland type of fish tank. If you want to go to the spa, you're going to go to the fish tank room to relax. But it has pools with the underground tunnels where you go from inside to outside. On one end, it has nude spas for adults, and then it has kids' playgrounds on another side and golf schools. It's just quite an extraordinary place. If you can't afford to stay there, you can go and have a lunch and watch the equestrian training, because they have glass. From the restaurant, there's a glass wall that looks out onto the horse training area. So it's just an extraordinary place. From there, if you had the money and you wanted to stay there for a couple of days, you could then visit all around this area. From there to Innsbruck are a number of places to visit. If you didn't want to stay there, obviously other places to stay. But between there to Innsbruck is the next stop, but some interesting things in the middle. So I'm always looking for castles, because I've written books on castles, and I'm looking for churches.
Well,
and on the way...
we said travel author, but we didn't say you have 5 books on castles.
5 books on castles, yeah. And I'm starting a series on churches and cathedrals.
Okay.
But somebody asks me what's my favorite castle, and now as I'm getting older, I say my favorite castles are the ones that have elevators, because I usually put castles on the top of the mountain. But the Castle Kufstein is just north. Stangelwirt is in a town called Going, which is interesting, but it's on the Kaiserweg road, but it's near the town of Kitzbühel. And it is known as a ski resort. So this is all like ski resort territory. So if you go in the wintertime, I don't know if this road trip is a summer road trip I took. If you take a winter road trip, that's a little bit different. But if you want to go skiing, it's a great place to go skiing. But Castle Kufstein, it's in the middle of the city, but it has an elevator. It's one of my new favorites. And another castle nearby on the way to Innsbruck is the Castle Empress, which is another excellent place to stop. But between the two of them is a rather remarkable Swarovski crystal world. If you know what Swarovski crystals are, they're jewelry. They're crystal jewelry. They are one of the famous crystal makers. But at the factory, which is halfway between Kitzbühel and Innsbruck, is the Swarovski factory. And at some point they decided if we're going to have a factory, we ought to have places for people to come and visit. So now there is this called the Swarovski Crystal World, which is, you would classify it as an amusement park. Its primary feature is you go inside. Underneath, there's a mountain with grass on it and a stone giant who is spitting out a river of waterfall. And you go into this, go under the waterfall, under the giant spittle waterfall, to go into this exhibit. And in this exhibit is some of the most extraordinary design crystal things done by different artists, different people. There's a series of rooms, themed rooms. You go from one to the other. But also in there are the artifacts that they've provided crystals for. Michael Jackson's glove is in there. The dress that Marilyn Monroe won to sing Happy Birthday, Mr. President is in there. There are costumes they did for Cher with sparkling crystals. There's Marlene Dietrich in there. There are modern people. There's a whole collection of what they call Hollywood. So all the things they designed for Hollywood. And the Rocket Man costume for Elton John. So you wander through there, and ultimately there's a gift shop at the end. But also there's a park with a maze and restaurants, and so it's like the Knott's Berry Farm of crystals. But it's all very popular. The parking lot is very large, so it must get a lot of visitors. It is not too far from Innsbruck. And Innsbruck is probably the farthest west Sisi site. It was the western palace of that family. It has one of the most extraordinary churches called the Hofkirche, the palace church. But in it is a tomb for one of the emperors, Frederick or Ferdinand. He's not in it. He built this massive tomb, which is extraordinary. It's by a metal gate, and that has all the gold cherubs and all the things that they put on those things. But they moved his body, so he's not actually there. But to be buried there, he wanted to be surrounded by his legendary idols. So there's a collection of statues in bronze of the great kings and dukes and knights of the Middle Ages, because this was back in the 1400s, 1500s.
Okay.
There's even King Arthur in there. So all the legendary knightly kings and queens standing before this great empty tomb. But it's quite extraordinary. But next door that's the Hofkirche, so it's connected to the Hof is the palace, so it's the palace church. It is connected to the Hofburg, which is the palace. And it has more imperial rooms with their paintings of Sisi and some other things. So that is the end of the road of the Sisi sites, as far west as Innsbruck. Lovely
You
thing.
are getting to the end of Austria, and I'm getting to the end of the length of an episode. So anything else we want to cover on this part? You could go on. As you said, there are sites in Germany and Switzerland. But anything else we want to cover in Austria?
No, this would be the end of this itinerary with a caveat or a choice. This is the end of the Austrian Sisi Road. So you've rented a car, and so you have two choices. If you drove one way, this would be a 10-hour drive on a motorway. So your choice is, do you drive back to Vienna and return the car in Vienna?
Right.
Or you could, in Innsbruck, you could just drop it at the railway station. As long as you drop off the car in the same country, you don't have the return charge. If you drive across the border to another country, it's going to cost you another 500 euros. So as long as you drop the car off in the same country, it's maybe 20 or 30 euros return charge. So you can easily just drop the car at the Innsbruck railway station and get a train and either go north into Germany or south into Italy and go on your further travels by train or however else you want to do it. If you want to keep driving, this is a trick. You have to find a return place that's not too far from a border, and they take a train across the border, and then you'd rent another car for the other country. On this trip, I had to drop off the car in Western Austria and take the train over to Switzerland and get another car to drive on the way. So you can drop the car at the railway station and take a train to wherever else you want to go. If you wanted to drive back towards Vienna, you could take the northerly route along the Danube River. You could stop in Salzburg, and then a little farther west is a place called the Wachau Valley, which is the wine-growing region along the Danube. And you can stop at a town called Dürnstein, which is where King Richard the Lionheart was held captive by an Austrian duke. That Austrian duke is buried at the Heiligenkreuz Abbey. So if you were at the Heiligenkreuz Abbey and you saw Duke Leopold V's gravesite there, if you go up to Dürnstein, that's where he kept King Richard I for ransom at a castle in Dürnstein. But it's a wine-growing region. And there's also a beautiful abbey up there, a very Baroque abbey called the Gottweg Abbey, which is almost like a Baroque town. And it's a lovely place to stop if you're wine touring and riding bicycles. And then from there, it's not too far a trip back to Vienna. So you could take a southern route to go west and like a northern route to go back, unless you want to leave the car and travel by train.
Excellent. I am going to start to wrap us up.
Okay.
Just for time reasons. As you think about Austria and this road trip that we've done through a lot of it here, if I tell you you're standing in the prettiest spot, where are you standing and what are you looking at?
Oh, man, there are so many. When you get to the end of this area, then you're getting into the Alps. The Vienna Woods, just to the west of Vienna, is very lovely. Beautiful, rolling hills and partly farms and partly trees, and it's gorgeous. If you go to the west, if you go the southern route, then you're close to the Dolomite Mountains, and the eastern end of the Alps. If you drive through some of these roads, I mentioned the winding road to get to Admont, that is beautiful territory there. But all of Austria is quite beautiful. As long as the weather's good.
Okay. I believe that was cheating way out, but I will let you get away with it. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Austria.
Oh, it didn't make me laugh. They drive very slowly in the cities. They have slow speed limits, and they mean it. And they have cameras that will take your picture if you do not obey the rules. So
and send you lovely souvenirs from your trip.
Send you a souvenir postcard, with a price tag. I haven't gotten one from Austria. I think I just barely missed one because I was following somebody through town, and I think the camera went off and shot them and not me. So I think I lucked out. Make me smile. I guess that's one that sort of a thing not happening makes me smile. The guys selling Mozart concert tickets in Vienna, I always get a kick out of it. If you go to the Sisi Museum, the Hofburg, right outside are all these guys wearing 18th century waistcoats. Like some New York guy trying to get you to go to a strip club will be out there handing you a pamphlet for a Mozart concert. And you go, is this a travel scam or something like that? No, but the Mozart concerts are real, and they're very entertaining. But it's weird. All these guys in these suits just go by, and they like gravitate to you to hand you a pamphlet. So that makes me smile.
Excellent. And if I had you to summarize this road trip through Austria in just 3 words, what 3 words are you going to pick?
Oh, God. Imperial sights in beauty.
And our guest again has been Michael January from bargaintraveleurope.com. And Michael, if we wanted to send people to your best post on Austria, where are we going to send them?
Another tricky question. I'd have to look it up. I'm sorry.
Do you have a post on this road trip and you'll send me a URL?
I will. Or if you go to my site and click on Austria.
Excellent.
One of the interesting, I was going to mention it, in Innsbruck. Right around the corner from the Hofburg Palace is the smallest store in Austria. It is a sausage store. It's like you have barely room to stand, surrounded by hanging walls of sausage. And you pick a sausage and you go outside and you have lunch. But that's one of my favorite places, just around the corner from the Hofkirche and the Hofpalace in Innsbruck. The smallest shop in Austria. Sausages.
And you've got a post for that we will link to in the show notes as well.
I do have a post for that.
Excellent. I'll find that link and we'll put that in. Michael, thank you so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Austria.
Thank you. And hopefully we can explore a little more.
A special thanks go out to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. If you're interested in learning what a patron gets, or you're interested in becoming a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler to learn more. For the show we did on London recently, I heard from Mark who said, "Hello, Chris. Really enjoyed the London show. I live in Southend, one of the gateway airports mentioned, a seaside resort which gets lots of day trippers from London. We also have the longest pleasure pier in the world at just over 1.3 miles. My tip for London is the Sky Garden in Fenchurch Street, close to the Tower of London and near to where I work. Fantastic views like the Shard, but with the bonus of it's free. Just need to book in advance, bar and restaurant at the top. Regards, Mark." Thanks, Mark. That I did not know about. There's always more to learn about London. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more.